Hello, welcome to episode 5 of the Must Make podcast. Hope you're good. Jack here. Hope you're all doing alright. This is all getting a bit long and drawn out, and it's a bit of a scary time in the news, and lots to be thinking about. Very sorry it's been a little while since the last episode with Alex, but I want to thank all of you who sent feedback and sort of enjoyed that episode. I think it was really nice to have a chat with Al, and he's actually back in the UK now, so I'm sure he's glad to be back, and that problem is over for him. I've just had loads and loads on, so sorry for the wait. I've just released a new project, the Late Night Soundtrack, which is what this podcast is going to be about. It might be a bit shorter than normal. So I've been doing all of that, and also juggling living in quite a small space with another person and finding the time to be able to get a bit of quiet to do it. Also sort of taking a bit of time to reflect on the first 4 episodes, because I'm aware that I don't want to just sort of cover the same ground with every guest and repeat the format. So I've taken a little bit of time to think about what's been really great and successful about the first 4 episodes, but also about where I want to move the conversation and where it maybe needs to go to keep things fresh and to also hit some new pastures. And sort of diversify the conversation. And also, I've been thinking about how I want to diversify the guests, because I'm really aware that the listenership is predominantly male, and obviously I've only had male guests, so I really want to have a more diverse group of people chat about the topic. And also I want to diversify outside of not just drum and bass and not just music, but sort of into some weird creative realms. So I've got some ideas about guests I'm going to have that might be a bit more challenging, and not necessarily drum and bass guests, and not even necessarily musicians, but people who've got interesting insights about creativity and about fostering good creative practice and good creative thinking. So that's going to be coming up in the next few episodes that I'm going to be trying to hammer through in the next few weeks. So keep locked in for that. Obviously, depending on what platform you're listening on now, you've either listened to the first 4 or you can go back and check them out. I've got an episode with D-Bridge, LSB, DRS and Alex Perez. They're on Spotify, Apple, all those other good platforms. Also, a bit of housekeeping. We've got the Must Make Facebook group. It's called the Must Make Podcast. There's a lot of really interesting discussion going on there, and it's formed the basis of today's podcast, all the questions and stuff. Another bit of housekeeping is that I've set up a Patreon page. Now, it's not obligatory. You don't have to go and, I'm not going to make people pay to receive this content. But the idea is that somehow I need to make this kind of work long term. And if I want to put more energy and I want to put more time and stuff into it, it's kind of the only metric I can gauge the value of this podcast, aside from the messages I get from people, which are amazing, by the way. So I've set up different tiers, but they're all going to be the same. It's basically just to become a supporter of the podcast, and the minimum is £1 a month up to the maximum. It's kind of whatever you want, and it means I can avoid having adverts. I was thinking about endorsements and all that sort of stuff, but I'm just not really interested in pairing with brands particularly, especially since there aren't many that can really get behind a podcast that's about pure creative process and thinking. The obvious ones are reaching out to sort of musical hardware and plug-in developers, and I know enough of those to try and make those connections, but I feel like it wouldn't fit right. So Patreon's there. It's Must Make Podcast on the Patreon page. Give if you want to. If not, don't worry. All good. If you feel like you're getting value, you can put in. If you don't, no stress. It just is there, and I'm not really sure how to frame it. There's no pressure. It's just, also for me and for everyone, it's a bit of a weird time where we don't know where things are going to be. So if I can make that something that is a valuable resource for people, and I can put some of that earning from it back into making more episodes, and also freeing up my time to think about these things and think about podcasts and music and all that sort of thing, great, perfect. If you can afford to do that and you want to, fantastic. if you're not asked, don't worry about it. All good. So anyway, episode 5, it's a bit of a weird one. I basically wanted to, while reflecting on the first 4 and thinking about moving forward, I thought, since I've just finished the project myself, the Late Night Soundtrack, I thought I would open up the questions to people on my socials and in the Must Make Podcast Facebook group to ask questions about my process, about the podcast, about anything really to do with music. And I've gone through and picked out some of my favourite questions about the project and about the podcast, and so on and so on and so on. There's some really amazing questions in there, so thank you for those. I've separated them out into some like themes, which I did in a Google Doc, and I'm going to try and go through some of the best of them and give you some answers and some thoughts, and also maybe expand a bit on some of the stuff I've been thinking about between episode 4 and today. There was a lot of great questions come in, and I didn't pick the ones that were specific to the Late Night Soundtrack project, but I did think it would be interesting, rather than it being a discussion with someone else, for me to have a little think about my process, and it also selfishly will sort of help me make sense of what has just been finished, and also what, by the questions that have been asked, it's delving into what stuff listeners are getting from the podcast. And I've picked out a load, and it's very difficult to work out in what order to answer them. But I'm going to start with one from India Fen, which I quite liked, which came via the Facebook page, and that is: how do you draw the line between self-criticism and self-deprecation? Well, that's a tough one, because you're in a constant struggle trying to think about critiquing what you're doing to make sure it's good, without beating yourself up and saying you're a piece of shit and you don't know what you're doing. And as you may have heard, like Alex say and Luke say, and all the guests actually, they all struggle with that, because it is just part of the creative endeavour. It's what everyone's dealing with. You'll have a shit day in the studio, and you'll go home thinking you are shit. And I don't know whether that ever gets easier, to be totally honest with you. I've been doing it full time for nearly 10 years, and I still get that every day that I work in music. And there isn't really a line. You can be, if you can get to a point where you're feeling good about what you're doing, and you can criticise what you're doing, but without beating yourself up, then you're onto something good, and you need to try and work out what you did on those occasions that helped you to be kind to yourself, and to recognise that you're human and fallible, and you'll make mistakes, and you'll have shit days, and not to beat yourself up about it. Yeah, that's my thinking on that one. There's a question from Repertoire regarding the importance of a workspace during lockdown, and how that workspace has now become an office space for lots of people working at home, and how that affects your creativity. From my perspective, I had a studio, which I haven't been to now since mid-March, which created a really nice separation between working and home. And now my studio is set up on the coffee table in my girlfriend's flat, and I'm recording the podcast there now. I've got everything set up here. I can't really work on music here because I just struggle working on headphones. And the separation is difficult, although I'm not working in my bedroom, so that is one degree of separation. But yeah, I do empathise with people who are using the same space to work and create in, because I do feel like a separation is required, and it's very tough, and I don't know what the answer is, other than to try and think about mixing up routine, and try and think about going out for a walk before you come back and work, or to change something about the room, move it if you can. It's not ideal situation for anyone, but I think at the minute it's about adapting and making the best. It's hard to say. Like, I haven't completed any music while I've been at home, but I've actually been all right about that, because I've found some other things to put my energy into, like this podcast, and I've been working on loads of animations. I also had quite a lot of music ready before lockdown happened. So I can be working on what's going to happen with that in the future. What else have I got? I find this really difficult actually, because you try not to be like it's hard to talk about yourself, especially when there's no one else here. I'm literally just reading questions off a piece of paper, and it's not easy at all. Alan Backup asks, now that the industry requires more than just musical production talent, what aspects of marketing, self-promotion and that side of things do you enjoy, and which do you find more laborious? Well, that leads on from what I was just saying about promoting a record. Like, there's lots that's very laborious. Metadata, anyone who runs a record label will tell you that metadata is not fun. I don't really like the rat race of social media, although I agree and understand that it does have a place now. I'm trying to think slightly differently about how I'm doing the press and promo for workforce stuff. Just trying to be a bit more honest and open, and sort of find some ideas that I want to try and put out into the world that make people think a bit more. And I'm not saying I'm doing that to any degree of success, but it's just something I'm definitely more conscious of, especially at the moment with this little break we're having. It's given a bit of more of a chance to think about what I think's important, what I enjoyed about what my job was before lockdown, and what bits I didn't enjoy, and how to work my lifestyle and my output around that to maintain healthy well-being physically, mentally, and also to be sustainable so I can pay my bills. And that was part of the reason why I said about the Patreon, to be honest, because selfishly I want to carry on the podcast, but if and when things go back to normal, I'd like to put energy into the podcast, but if I have to make money by gigging and doing this and the other, it's going to be tough to justify that, and it's going to be tough to find the energy and the wherewithal, and also just like the money to do it. Like, I'm not rich by any stretch, but I'm aware that I'm in a very privileged position compared to most people out there at the moment. You know, I'm able to have a bit of time to think about what I'm doing and sit here and answer these questions for you that have been sent over the internet. Do you find a change in environment / surroundings have an overall effect on your creative process? And what does your place of creativity studio have that helps with spurring a new idea? That's from Sean McCoskery. Yes. Well, it is important. As we just discussed with regard to a separation, for me it's very important that there's a separation between the place that you work and the place that you live. I haven't had a bedroom studio since 2012. After we finished Spectral Soul Delay No More album, we moved into a studio in South London, and that separation immediately became important, but it also became a bit of a burden too, because you felt burdened to be there all the time, and sometimes that wouldn't create your best work. Whereas before, we just shared a studio and we'd dip in and out. And like I said at the minute, I've not written much music at home because I just can't. I find it very difficult. The way that I work, I've not got any speakers set up. I've just been putting my energy into learning how to animate, and that's been really fun. It is important, but I would say to people at home to think about the space, not just physically, but also headspace. If you can think about how to differentiate the time that you're spending doing work stuff and the time that you're spending making and creating. And I think Darren touched on this in episode 1, where he was talking about having limited time because he had 2 kids, and he made sure that when he had his time, everything was set up so that when he had a little 2-hour window, he could go in and make things happen and not put too much pressure on the time. Because if you go in and think, I have to get something out of this time, or you think, I'm never going to get something done because I've been working here all day, you definitely won't. So it's about doing the work, being in the right place and thinking about it strategically, and also just being a bit adaptable. Will Stanley: do you ever find that after working on something for so long and knowing it inside out, you sometimes end up not liking the music you release? And how do you deal with doubts and objectivity when listening to your own music? that's a really tough one, and it's a very good question. You either love it or hate it after a while, and I think you need a detachment is important. I've sometimes released music very soon after completing it and looked back and thought, I wish I hadn't done that, because I would want to change things about that now. And it's I think the detachment emotionally and sort of just physically and mentally over time means that you can be more objective with what it is that you've made, because you inevitably, when you first finish something, think it's the dogs, you think it's great, and it's only either the morning after and sometimes longer you go, actually that isn't very good, or actually that is better than I thought it was at the time. And your relationship with work develops. Like, I think I discussed this a bit with Darren in episode 1. I've got really tight connections and I've got really strong feelings about certain tracks that I've made, workforce tracks, that are not based on how good the tune is, but just something about it and the process and the way it came about endears itself to me and in my memory, makes me feel closer and more attached to that. And they're not the tunes that people would pick up on, to be honest. And that actually leads on to, and I can expand upon that while touching on James Perez's question, which is, what's your favourite track of the whole album and why? And which track caused you the most grief to finalise and why? God. Okay, one of my favourite tracks is, and it is the one that I've got quite a lot of attachment to, is a track called Setting Traps, and it was on the first EP. I don't know why I like it. I think it's because it's really simple. It's always sounded really good when I play it out, and it makes me feel a certain way when I do it. Not when I do it, when I play it. I made it on all the Electron gear. The drums are from the analog rhythm, and all the synth parts are from the analog 4. And I think I made the whole loop just using that gear, and that was in the early playful experimental stages of not really knowing what the fuck those bits of kit do, but just messing around with them, setting them up and hitting record, and that tune came out of it. And sometimes the process can determine how you feel about something, and I'm not saying that's the best record I've ever made, or that it's the one that people love or whatever, and it's probably not, but I really like it for that reason. And I think that's important from a creative standpoint, is to not be told what your best records are by other people. I know that sounds weird, but it's like, you can't just respond to people's responses, otherwise you're basically just sort of being directed by your fans, and you're not serving them that well if you do that. You're serving them better, in my opinion, if you ignore them. And that comes from something that what's his name, Rick Rubin, put up on Instagram the other day, where you just sort of, he said, you do a disservice to your fans if you don't ignore them. You're doing them the best service if you ignore them. And that sounds awful, but it's like, you make the most self-indulgent music if you don't listen to feedback and you don't listen to critique, and ultimately that creates the best output, I think. All right. What have we covered and what have we not? Alex Joseph, what is the role of luck in the life and career of a musician? Can you make your own luck? I think you'd get a different answer depending on who you ask. I think that I know people who have made their own luck because they work really, really hard and have therefore managed to get through and cut through the noise. And I also know people that are incredibly talented and don't work as hard but smash it because their talent is just insane. I do think you can make your own luck, and I think if you're aware and honest about what your abilities are, it's really just, you can make your own luck by working really hard, and that's it. And there is, whenever people ask like what's the tip and trick to get a certain place, I would just say put the time in, put the hours in, and work hard, and be honest with yourself about how hard you're working. But within reason, you can make your own luck. I think there's certain other aspects of life, like socio-economic stuff, that means that certain people will be advantaged and disadvantaged with regard to making a career in a creative sphere. But that's a whole other discussion, about some other aspects of our music and of the creative industries and what's changed and how certain voices are overrepresented and certain other voices are underrepresented. Maybe that's something I'll touch on in a future episode. I think that could be quite an interesting conversation. Tom Lawson asks, do you ever struggle with balancing creative experimentation and trying new things musically versus trying to maintain your sound to avoid potential backlash from fans/followers? The old, I prefer their earlier stuff syndrome. I struggle with this myself, so it'd be interesting to hear your take. Thanks. I think this leads on again from what I just said about trying to ignore both positive, negative and indifferent feedback. I think if you're honest with yourself and you love what you're making, that will resonate with people. And it was part of the problem with Spectral Soul, I have to say, was like we were constantly sort of put in a box in terms of people would just like label us as a liquid act. And it's like, you don't know our discography if you think we're a liquid act, because, you know, one of our biggest tunes was called Untitled Horn. That is not a liquid tune. So, and also all of our older repertoire was not liquid, but people try and put you in a box, and that becomes restrictive and it becomes a rod for your back. And Spotify creates that problem as well, where the more musical, liquidy stuff does get more listens because it's more palatable at home, and that skews your numbers on that platform. So people start going, oh, well, that one's really popular, so maybe I'll make more of that kind of thing. And that is listening to and looking at feedback and responding to feedback, where I feel like you'd be doing everyone a better service if you did keep that creative experimentation and trying new things at the forefront of your thinking when making music, because you're not going to reinvent the wheel if you just aim for the same thing again. And again, I would caveat that by saying the late night soundtrack music and all the workforce music, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel with every tune. Let me just say, I'm trying lots of different styles because I'm basically like an erratic, bored person. I get bored quickly, so I have to go from style to style to try and keep myself interested. And I am, in certain tracks and certain experimentations, trying to push things on a bit and keep myself playful and experimental. And I would say, again, to go back to the idea, to go back to what I was saying about doing animation at home instead of music, I've found that to be really liberating, in the sense that you can be really playful, and it's reminded me how important playfulness is in terms of creating great work, because you have to set the circumstances and the conditions under which good, happy accidents can happen. And little accidents are the bits of magic that happen in tracks that you could never make if you considered to make them. If you thought, I want to make something sound this sort of quirky way, you don't really achieve that unless you're experimenting and being playful with process and with sound and being open-minded and trying new things. If you put things all through the same prism every time, you're going to get exactly the same result every time. You have to be playful, you have to be sort of kind of childlike with it almost, and approaching new processes like animation really helped me with that, because it reminded me, actually, I don't know what any of this stuff does, so I can just play with it without any consequence and see what comes out. And it's reminded me to go back and do that with the way that I work with music. So that is really important. Playfulness, creative experimentation, and try to not give too much attention to the feedback and the critique that you get from people regarding your music, because otherwise you're literally just doing what they say, and that ain't serving them very well. You have to put yourself out and try and piss people off. And again, I caveat that by saying I haven't always done that. I have to keep saying that. It's like, you know, I'm not saying I'm the best at that, but I'm saying that's what you should do. It's not always what I do, to be fair. Joel McSherry, what are your thoughts on learning through process, trial and error, or jumping straight on the hunt for a tutorial or something similar to get over a technical hurdle within a creative program? It's so easy now sourcing information, which is really time efficient, but at the same time it's taking away from the creative grind. Or use what's available because it speeds up the process. I think this is similar but does touch on something else, which is that I've never thought that the tools are that important, and that's why this podcast exists. It's because I wanted to focus on what the creative process looks like for people, what the struggles are for people, and what unites us as creatives in terms of that process, and not think about the tools, because like Joel is saying here, you can go online and find the answer to any technical FAQ question regarding software. There'll be someone online that will have had the same problem and solved it, and you can find the answer. And I've had that with After Effects, learning animation. I've had it with Logic, with my production. If I get stuck with something, you go online, you Google it, you'll find the answer. So you want to be focusing, I think, on the playfulness and on the process, and everything that exists outside of the tools. The tools should be working for you to create great sound, not the other way around, if that makes sense. It doesn't really make sense, but it's like, don't focus on the tools. Don't focus on what you want to end up with. Focus on the process. Focus on putting time into your process and learning what you're about and what your art is going to be, what you're standing for, and what sort of music you want to put into the world that's about you and is truthful and is of good representation. But yes, the internet is a great resource, and use it. Definitely use it. There's so many great free resources out there. Obviously, I would never deter anyone. I use it all the time. But trial and error is important. You have to make mistakes in order to learn. And if you're not willing to make mistakes, you're sort of saying that you've cracked it, and no one has. I haven't. You have to keep experimenting. Keep going with it. Finian Kelly. If something goes wrong in the studio or creatively, if it's just not flowing, or you think everything is shit, how do you deal with it? Throw a tantrum, take a break, or struggle through? That's a tough one, and I'm really bad at this. I have days when things aren't going well, and it can ruin the subsequent 3 or 4 days of work. The objective me, outside looking in, would say, don't beat yourself up. Take yourself out of the situation. Admit that you're a human being that will have shit days, and go off and do something else. Do something else that can stir your creativity a bit. Sometimes I can just watch a bit of a documentary, or listen to some other music, or cook some food, or play a computer game, do whatever. Something that is like meditative, go for a walk, whatever. Something that frees your brain up. But often, and I'm first to admit, I can be the worst in terms of beating myself up or being really pissed off that something good didn't come out of a day. So just be aware that is part of the struggle for everybody. It's not just you. I think that's been one of the themes that's come out of this podcast and from the messages that I've got from people, and it's been really heartening. So thank you for everyone that's messaged, by the way. Is that people are saying that it's made them realise that they're not on their own in the struggle for trying to create something and having a bad or shit day or getting creative block or whatever. If that's all that comes out of this podcast, fucking great. That's brilliant. Yeah, everyone is the same. Everyone has shit days. Everyone has good days. And I don't think people don't see those days that feel like a grind for artists. You know, they only see the end result and they think, shit, like this person's cracked it, and it's not that case, not the case at all. You know, everyone has really shit days. Like, fundamentally, that's just it. It's how you sort of respond to those shit days, I guess. And I still struggle big time with shit days, so don't beat yourself up about it. What else have we got here? Oh, this is a good one. From Jean or Jean Singer, apologies if I got that wrong. It says, how do you cope with envy? For example, you just made a really decent track and then suddenly your friend comes along who's been doing it for less time and is nailing it effortlessly. That's tough. And I empathise with that. I still get that. It's very difficult. There's certain people who just make stuff effortlessly, and it's really not, it shouldn't be. You should be happy for them, but there's a certain element of you that's like, fuck, I've worked really hard to make this thing, and then someone else just comes on and makes it. It's friendly competition, and that kind of, it's not envy, but that sort of keeping an eye on what people are doing, it's important. It keeps innovation going. It's kind of like no one would, if you weren't challenged, or someone laying down a sort of gauntlet, you'd never. I just don't know whether you'd feel the need to try harder or to work to a level. That nature is within human beings to sort of compete a bit, I think. So I don't deal with it is the honest answer, but it is there. And I think just objectively being aware of that feeling when it creeps in and being a bit like, actually, like I recognise what that feeling is, and it's not necessarily healthy, and you should try and turn it into a positive thing and be like, well, I'm super stoked for him because he's just managed to churn them out. Alex is a good example of one for me. Like, whenever I write a batch of music, I'm like, yeah, I think this is pretty good. He'll send his new EP and you're like, for fuck's sake. He's like one of a few who I've known for years, and I think it is because him and I are roughly the same age and came through at roughly the same time. He has that ability to send me music and I'm like, fuck, like this is so good. And yeah, that does spur, but it does spur me on, and you can use it as fuel or you can use it negatively to push you down. I think it depends on your reaction to that envy, as opposed to having a problem with the envy itself. It should be used as a fuel, not as a deterrent or as something to push you down. Max Burnell asks, have any philosophies or other areas of education which are non-musical influenced the way you think about production? I do try and keep up with like current affairs and shit, although it's very bad for my mental health. So I often have to tune out because I get too involved and get angry, and that winds me up. But that part of that mindset and the way that I work does keep me inquisitive about process and about art and about other things going on in the world. But I would say that from a creative standpoint, I don't know whether I would adhere to a philosophical standpoint, although I've read little bits about Buddhism and meditation and stuff. I think you can take little bits of it, not the whole thing. I definitely wouldn't be the creative person that I am if it wasn't for my tutor at university called Nick Hughes, who sadly passed away about 10 years ago, unfortunately. But he was a huge influence on my creative thinking, especially in my third year of university. I did a lot of growing then, because I studied graphic design, but it was more of like a fine art degree, and we had lots of oblique strategies about dealing with creative problems, and he really pushed on my thinking from, I would call it, from like two-dimensional thinking to really three-dimensional thinking, like outside the box, challenging us to really think a few steps ahead of what your brain would usually think about a process. And I'm as a side note, I'm thinking about putting something together for podcast listeners as like a set of oblique strategies, and also like a resource list for people of things that I've read that I think are interesting, and things that people have sent me that I think are pretty cool. And if you're stuck for ideas or oblique strategies, or you're got a creative block or whatever, give you like an article to read or some other musing to think about. And he gave me the idea for that, because at university he had a big list on the wall of different things you could do if you were stuck. It was like distort, reverse, and different adjectives that if you were stuck and listening to your little loop in a computer, you could go, right, fuck, I'm stuck here. This sound could sound a bit better. Let's have a look through this list of potential things I could do here. Let's try that one. And then combine 2 or combine 3 of those things and see what you end up with. And also I'm thinking about potentially doing some video content around this with regard to process, so that it won't be another technical tutorial telling you about how I've done my drums or my snares or all that sort of thing, but it's more about not even sound design, but once you've got a sound, how much you can get out of it just through a few processes, and how much you can get out of it in terms of making it more unique and distinct through a few processes. So yeah, that's something I might think about doing in the future. Barney Blackhurst, how do you balance your social life and spending time in the studio? Well, I don't, is the answer. My social life is a bit dry, to be totally honest with you, because my hobby is my job. So yeah, my friends would say I don't see them enough. My girlfriend would say I never stop working and I'm always thinking about work. So it is a balancing act, and like you said in the question, how do I balance? The answer is I don't, but the intention is to try and balance it better. But I'm just always thinking about work. I'm always thinking about the next thing, and I'm always thinking about the next thing I'm going to make, or the next thing I'm going to do, and I don't know. And again, it's the reason why this podcast is called Must Make. It's the reason why my label is called Must Make Music. It's because there's a compulsion there. I think if I stopped thinking about it, that my value would diminish or something. I don't know. It's all irrational, but I just feel this compulsion to be working all the time. I have periods when I can let my hair down and enjoy my social life, but especially at the moment, given that I've not left my house really for sort of 10 weeks, that social life is gone. And I can't even remember what the balance looked like before, so that is tough. But yeah, I don't have an answer for that really, other than to say that I don't balance it very well. Also, my hay fever is awful, so if you can hear my nose, it's pretty bad. Trick Beats asks, boring question, but I would love to know if you have any methods to overcome tinnitus when in the studio. Tell me everything will be okay, Jack. Everything will be okay. I have developed mild tinnitus in the last few months, and I think I've had it for a while, but I've only just become aware of it. It's like when I'm tired, when I'm stressed, if I've been working in the studio too loud for like a whole few days back to back, it's horrid and it's torturous. And the only thing I can say in terms of methods to curtail it is to work quieter, take breaks, and also try and keep your stress down and sleep well, which is easier said than done when you're suffering with it. So I'm sorry that that's happening for you. That's very difficult, and there's a lot of my peers who struggle with it. Wear earplugs when you go to clubs, if we ever get back there. Hope we do. There are some great companies out there, cost about 140 quid. It's not cheap, but they'll last you for a very long time, and they'll protect your ears, and you can still hear perfectly well. You can still talk to all your mates. You get used to it. It's not great to start with, but then it becomes the norm. But hearing protection is just so important, especially within our culture where rooms are packed full of very, very loud sound. What else we got? Tom Chon asked a really interesting question, which I might have a slightly bigger answer for on a future episode. But he asks, how do you think small/moderate sized clubs will survive, if they will, and adapt? What are your concerns for the genre, culture, other producers these days? Well, I just released a song called Really Obnoxious Rich Kids, where I sampled Keith Riley, who's one of the founders of Fabric, and he's talking about the homogenization and sort of sterilization of club culture and how ticket prices are going up, DJ fees are going up, and that excludes certain segments of societies. That's slightly deviating away from the question, but it comes under the same banner of looking after these little incubating venues that give small acts the platform to break and to reach fans and to do small sellout shows to new fans. They're super important, and I feel like this comes under a heading for a podcast I'm going to do in the future, which is about the responsibility and the societal role of a creative and what that entails and what that looks like. And I'm in this period of time when we're not clubbing, I'm thinking about it a lot more in terms of what are my responsibilities to the music, to the culture, to the world, really, I guess, in a more macro sense. And that comes down to what causes I think are really important and what ones I want to get behind. But also to talk specifically about this question, it's about how are we as DJs going to support and maintain and try and keep open these small venues that are so important. And I think what's going to be interesting when and if things go back to normal, these are the venues that will open first. So ironically, they'll be the first place that people will be able to go and play. So I think there'll be a lot of demand for DJs, from the DJs, to go and be playing these small venues because they can. So there's a potential there to get behind them and support them. I feel like you could support them through some sort of progressive taxation of bigger events, or through better funded arts councils, some sort of subsidization from government could be a way forward. I just think actually that creative industries have been so undervalued by us in the UK anyway, that as a fundamental thing. So there is very little value placed on clubs. You've seen how many clubs have been shut down because developers have built, housing near to them and then won petitions to shut down the venue after they bought it. So that shows that the priority is to build housing over incubating culture. So I think there is going to be a certain responsibility for people and for us as DJs to bring our sets and to think about how much we're charging to play at these smaller venues. And it was certainly something when I started the Workforce project that I wanted to consider as well, because I felt that there was a potential that it was getting a little bit out of hand in terms of big festivals not representing the true experience of club culture or drum and bass culture in our world. And I wanted to try and offer a more authentic clubbing experience. And I know this sort of sounds a bit aloof and whatever, but it's something I've been thinking about and talking to people about anyway, is that we need to start representing and standing up for the things that are important. JDLR is a good example. I've spoken to him a fair bit about it in terms of him wanting to play club shows where they've guaranteed a good sound system, because he knows that that's going to translate what he does in the best possible way and his brand. And that is what clubbing should be. It should be sort of dank rooms with big sound systems. Not damp rooms with sound systems in basements with sort of not big production, just sort of like a few lights and a DJ booth on the floor, and proper musical experiences. And I'm showing my age. So yeah, it'd be really good if I had like a producer just passing me these questions, to be honest. Aidan Azzi asks, at what point in your career did you make the jump from working a full-time job to music? Or in easier words, what was it like leaving the workforce to be workforce? Very nice. I'll be honest, I never really was in the workforce fully, because I went to school and college, then I took a year out and did some travelling, went to university, and when I went to university I was 19, 20, and we'd already put out our first record when I went in 2006. And then when I was at university between 2009 and 2011, Spectrasol really started to pick up a bit of momentum. And then when I left university, I stayed in London and we wrote our first album, Delay No More. And I went full time at that point, and I've just not looked back. There's been points, I'm not going to lie, there's been points when it's been very difficult money-wise, and I have looked at rejoining the workforce, so to speak, or finding a part-time job. But I wouldn't say it's an aspiration I would encourage people to go for, because it comes down to the financial struggle between making a living and doing the art you want to do, and there will always have to be a compromise if you want to make ends meet, unless you somehow make music that is a perfect expression of what you want to make, and it could be alternative, and especially within drum and bass it's going to be alternative. There will be compromises that need to be made for you to pay your bills. That's just the the crux of it. So there's certain people, as I discussed with Luke LSB in his episode, he still works a few days a week, and that frees him up creatively and headspace wise to write whatever the fuck he wants when he writes his music, and that is really important from a creative standpoint. And I do envy that. I have to say, I've worked full-time in music now for like nearly 10 years, and I envy people that don't have that financial pressure on what they're doing. And I've found in the last couple of years where I've been living back in Brighton and it's been very cheap for me to live, that I'm aware how lucky I am to be able to have the creative freedom again and to be sort of financially a bit more secure. And that's really important. So I wouldn't take the leap, to be honest. On reflection, I wouldn't take the leap. I would try and keep it as much a hobby and as playful as possible for as long as possible. Ben Cass asks, when making tunes, do you put any thought into how you want them to be played out during sets by yourself or other DJs? If so, how much of your tune design process gears itself towards making a tune that will blend really well with a variety of other tunes versus solo listening? It's a very good question. I think within drum and bass you have to always consider that. If you want your music to be played, you always have to consider how mixable it is and how club friendly it is. But I think where drum and bass comes into its own is that you can, within a big project, you can write, say, 60% non-DJ tunes, and as long as the 40% are really strong DJ tunes. The context of our music is very important, and I would say that about all creative output, unless it's totally self-indulgent and not club-centric. You have to be thinking about the context, and you have to be thinking about, in our world, how it's to be received, unless you have that true punk attitude of not giving a fuck. But especially in drum and bass, there is that formula that it has to have hit certain criteria to be able to be played in a club. And then if you don't have those criteria, then it limits the amount of people that will play your music, and that potentially limits the amount of people who will hear it. It's rare that tunes that aren't club friendly or DJ friendly cross over, and it's sad because lots of music gets lost that way, but unfortunately that is the restriction within our genre, and we have to be aware of that. I think with this late night soundtrack project I've just done is I'm trying to bridge the gap between both, and it's what we've always done as Spectracell as well, is to try and make sure that the music is consumable at home but also works in a club. And again, I don't always get that right, and I don't do that with every tune, but there's certain tunes that I know work in a club but also work at home, and I intended to do them that way. So I guess it just depends what you want, what you're trying to achieve, but equally don't go in trying to achieve a certain thing. You just have to be led by the process and led by what feels right. And again, it comes back to thinking about your audience. If you give them too much power in terms of their feedback and what they want from you, you're inevitably just going to be making the same thing again and again. So you have to be challenging yourself and the audience, and that is tough in drum and bass because you have to, like I said, hit certain criteria. My friend Joss asks a question. Joss says, for me, something you do exquisitely is vocals. Well done. Well, thank you, Joss. Can you talk us through your favourite song of choice vocally, either you've made or something that's inspired you, and maybe give direction as to what artists you'd like to work with going forward from a vocal point of view? D'Angelo, love D'Angelo. I've always harped on about D'Angelo. Love his vocal production. I'm a bit funny with vocals in that I don't really listen to the lyrics often. I'll get sent a demo and I'm listening to the melody and how it fits with the music as opposed to the lyrics. So I don't really listen to the lyrics. It's weird. There's a couple of vocal tunes that I've been involved in over the years that I'm really proud of. Forsaken with Alex Perez is one. I have to give him the credit for that. He cut that vocal up like that, and he's a don. Really pleased with the tune I did with Del, Cheap Love. He sent that demo back and nothing changed. Swear to God. The recording he sent me of his sung vocal, all the effects, everything is him. All I did was mix it a little bit. So, Del is an absolute whiz. The guy's a genius. the only thing I went back and said to him was, can we have a second verse? And that's it. And then his recording sent over, I mixed it, put it in the tune, sick. So big up Del. He's incredible, basically. What vocalist do I want to work with? God, I mean, there's like bucket list ones, obviously. But I love R&B singers. I love soul singers, jazz singers. Yeah. I just keep my ear out, but I often use samples as well, so it's cheeky. Amadura, sorry if I've mispronounced that, says, how does DJing through the night as well as the constant travelling affect your creative process? I can imagine when DJ season is busy, it means you may not be receiving consistent and adequate sleep. Do you feel this affects your ability to create content, and do you have a process to deal with this? It does. There's no way around it. It can be quite taxing, especially the longer tours. You really have to, put a couple of weeks aside when you get back to get over it. It's very tough. And yes, it does affect your decision making. It affects your ability to make art and create stuff. Yeah, and that's actually been one of the nice things about lockdown and no gigs, is that I wake up on Monday and I'm relatively fresh if I've not drunk too much wine over the weekend. So you can make more conscious decisions and you're not knackered. Also, when gigs were happening and it was late nights and lots of travel, you'd often get back and you're knackered on Monday, Tuesday, you're gigging again on Friday, and often you don't get out the blocks because you've only got 2 or 3 days in the middle of the week to do it. And I was a sucker for that, to be honest. If I don't have a clear run of time ahead of me where I've not got gigs, I struggle to bed in and get on with it. So it is tough, but it's about implementing a nice routine, trying not to drink too much, trying to get as much rest as you can in between. Yeah, it is difficult. Dublin 28. Here's a good one. How do you break out of the dreaded 4/18 16-bar loop? Tough one. You can force yourself out of it. If you've got a 4-bar loop that you think is cool, you can just make it into an 8-bar loop, fuck around with the sounds that you've got, put some more in, and just force yourself to keep moving. If you get hung up on certain things, as soon as you start thinking about the process or critiquing what you're doing, as we've discussed in previous episodes, it becomes about you thinking about the reception of it, or like critiquing what you're doing, where you should just be allowing the process to dictate at what pace you're going. And usually the ones that go faster are better, but not always. There is no hard and fast rule for getting out of a 4 or smaller loop. You just have to find some confidence and keep moving, keep putting sounds in, keep experimenting, keep being playful. And if it's still not doing it for you when you're doing all of those things, it's probably time to move on, and don't beat yourself up about it. You can't write the good tunes without writing the shit ones. It really is how it is. You work 100 hours and then nothing will happen, or shit stuff will happen, and then you'll do 1 hour and some good stuff will happen. That's just my experience with it. Keep experimenting. Like I said, I'm going to try and get these oblique strategy things going. In fact, you should check out the Brian Eno ones already. I think they're online. It's called Oblique Strategies. It gives you some things to ponder and think about if you're stuck on a creative hurdle. Worth checking out. Right, I reckon I've got a couple more. Do I do a rough master of my tunes before I play them out? Yeah, I do, but I've got really into just clipping and a bit of EQ and compression, nothing too crazy. It's important, otherwise your tracks just don't stand up against other people's music. Okay, The Skeptics. If you could give one piece of solid advice to up-and-coming producers, what would it be? How do you approach your music writing? Do you have specific ideas in mind, or do you see where it takes you and start with no script, so to speak? Yeah, I start with no script. I'll usually start with a few sounds and just allow, like I've said before, the process to dictate where it's going to go. And often allowing that to happen and then detaching and giving yourself a bit of time to think about it and then coming back, you make good decisions with the stuff that you made when you weren't thinking, if that makes sense. So you allow the process to happen, don't critique it, try and work through whatever you're doing, save the project, maybe bounce the loop and save the project to the same title as the loop, and then flick through that later if you're looking for something to work on. I've seen quite a few people work that way. I don't often, but there has been a number of times when I've gone back and looked at old projects and thought, fuck, why didn't I finish that? It's actually really good. Because often at the time you're making it, you might be in a mood, or you might not be in the right headspace to finish it, and it just might not allow you to do it. So sometimes you go back with a fresh perspective and a different headspace, and you can. In terms of a piece of advice to up-and-coming producers, it would be that there isn't any tip or a trick that anyone can tell you that's going to make it click for you. It's just, the only thing I can think is to put in as much time and energy and effort as you can. And be confident and be yourself, and as Del said in episode 3, and I think it's the most smashing bit of advice, smashing, I actually just said that, is to be honest. Be honest about what you're about, be honest about how good your music is, and don't, like, if as soon as you're dishonest to yourself, it's kind of when you're losing. You've got to be honest. It's time, it's just time. And I say that to everybody, it's just put in as much time and energy as you can. Grind. And just nag people as well. Send them demos, nag them. Okay, I reckon this is going to be the last question. How do you feel about the progression of your solo career? Well, I'm happy. And the progression is going at its own pace, and I'm sort of pleased with the feedback, but again, like I said, trying to not give it too much attention. I think really it's given me pause for thought, or no, not pause for thought, cause for pause, to think about myself and my voice and what I'm about and my identity within music and my output. And so that's been the biggest thing for me. The nicest thing about it is that it's given me my own voice, not one within a duo. And I love Spectral Soul, but I also love that I'm able to sort of just have my own voice and my own progression and make all my own choices about what it's going to look and feel like and sound like, and who I'm going to affiliate with, and it's just been a bit of a revelation. I've got more energy than I've ever had. I feel more hungry than I've felt, so it's been great. And I want to thank everybody for these questions. I don't know how good this has been. It's been very weird for me to be sat with all the windows closed in a very hot room, reading questions off a paper and trying to do my best to answer them, but without anyone prodding me for further answers or in a direction. So maybe I should have got someone to interview me for it. But this is a whole learning process. Like I said before, I've got some really interesting guests for the next few episodes, and we're going to try and get into some weirder territory and some more interesting learning outside of drum and bass DJs. So thank you for listening, and I hope that's been informative. Please respond with your comments and further questions in the Must Make podcast group or via the Patreon page. I'm always in the group, responding, talking to people, so we can carry on this conversation in there, and I'm happy to answer follow-up questions and stuff like that over that medium. The Late Night Soundtrack project is out now. You can get it on my Bandcamp. Anyone that wants to rep on Bandcamp, thank you very much. There's a bonus track on there, Love Gone, and got more music coming this year. We'll let you know about that later. But for now, thank you to everyone for listening, and thank you for supporting, and thank you for your questions. Peace.